They chained her for stealing a horse, and by sunset, the town would wish they hadn't. The sun stood high over Red Hollow, baking the dust into a dull gold that clung to boots and breath alike. And right there in the middle of Main Street, Sheriff Caleb Dorsey tightened the iron around the young Apache girl's wrists, as if the act itself needed no witness, no proof, no reason beyond the silence of those watching. Her name was Naya, though no one asked it, and she did not fight, did not plead, only stood with her shoulders straight while the chain settled cold against her skin, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in a town that pretended not to notice. A wagon creaked somewhere behind, a screen door tapped in the dry wind, and still no one stepped forward. Caleb didn't look at her eyes, not once. His gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if meeting it might ask him a question he didn't want to answer. Horse went missing at first light, he said flatly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. And she was the only one out there. The words hung in the heat, thin and brittle, and even the men leaning against the saloon posts shifted just slightly, like they felt something crack but couldn't name it. Naya's fingers tightened for a moment, not in fear, but in something steadier, something older, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, calm, almost lost in the wind. "You're not arresting me," she said. And Caleb paused just long enough for it to matter. "You're arresting what you don't understand." The sentence settled heavier than the chain itself, and for a second, the town held its breath. A boy near the water trough glanced between them, then quickly looked down, scuffing his boot into the dust as if erasing something he hadn't meant to see. Caleb exhaled through his nose, short, controlled, and turned away, guiding her toward the small wooden jail at the edge of the street. Each step measured, deliberate, like a man walking a line he couldn't step off. The door groaned as it opened, sunlight slicing through the dim interior, catching on the metal bars and the empty space behind them. And when he closed it, the sound was final in a way that felt too loud for such a quiet afternoon. Outside, the town returned to its rhythm, or tried to, boots moving, voices low, but something had shifted, something small and invisible, like the moment before a storm when the air forgets how to move. Inside the cell, Naya sat without slumping, her back straight against the rough wood, her eyes steady on the thin strip of light that slipped through the window, dust drifting through it like time itself had slowed to watch. In her palm, hidden from view, lay a small, silver necklace, its surface worn smooth by years and meaning. Not hers to keep, not hers to claim, but hers now to protect. And her fingers closed around it gently, as if holding not metal, but consequence. Somewhere far beyond the town, where the land stretched wide and unbroken, a line of riders had already turned their horses toward Red Hollow, though no one here knew it yet. Not the men at the saloon, not the boy at the trough, and certainly not the sheriff who stood on the porch, staring out at nothing in particular, telling himself the quiet in his chest was certainty, not doubt. The wind shifted again, just slightly, carrying with it a sound too distant to name, and for the briefest moment, Caleb Dorsey felt it, a weight he couldn't explain, pressing at the edge of his thoughts, like something coming closer, something patient, something that didn't need to rush. Behind him, the cell remained still, and Naya did not move, did not call out, did not ask to be heard, because she already understood something the town did not. That truth, when held long enough, doesn't shout, it arrives. The town did not speak about it, but it felt it, like heat trapped under wood, like something waiting beneath the surface of an ordinary afternoon. Inside the small jail, the air carried the scent of dry timber and iron, and the thin beam of sunlight had shifted just a few inches across the floor, marking time in a way no clock ever could, while Naya remained still, her breathing slow, her eyes following the dust that drifted through the light, as if each particle carried a message she already understood. Outside, Sheriff Caleb Dorsey stood on the porch longer than necessary, his hand resting on the wooden rail, fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if he had forgotten why he started. And across the street, a few men lingered where they always did, pretending to discuss cattle prices and weather, but their glances kept drifting back toward the jail door, quick and careful, like men who did not want to be seen seeing. The boy by the trough had not left, though his chores were long done. And he watched the sheriff now with the kind of quiet attention that children carry when they sense something adults refuse to name, his small hand gripping the edge of the wood as if holding himself in place. Caleb adjusted his hat, though the sun had not changed, and stepped down into the dust, boots pressing firm, each step louder than it should have been, and as he crossed toward the saloon, the door creaked open before he reached it, as if the building itself had been waiting. Inside, the light dimmed, voices lowered, and for a moment no one spoke to him directly, until a man near the bar cleared his throat and said, not quite looking up, "That girl. You sure about it?" The question hung in the air, thin but sharp, and Caleb paused just long enough to feel it land, then answered without turning, "I do not make mistakes." The words came out steady, practiced, but something in the room shifted anyway, something small and uncertain. Back in the cell, Naya's fingers loosened slightly around the silver necklace, letting it rest against her palm. Cool and familiar, and she turned it once, slowly, the faint glint catching the light before, disappearing again, and for a moment, her gaze softened, not with fear, but with memory, as if the object held more than metal, more than weight, something tied to choices already made. A soft sound came from the street, distant, easy to miss, like wind brushing across open land, and the boy heard it first, his head lifting just slightly, eyes narrowing toward the far edge of town where the road stretched out into heat and horizon. And though nothing was visible yet, something in the air had changed, the silence deeper now, heavier, as if the town itself had begun to listen. Caleb stepped back outside, the brightness hitting him again, and he paused at the top of the steps, scanning the empty road without knowing why, his jaw tightening just a fraction, and behind him, the saloon door swung gently, tapping once, then settling. A woman across the street pulled her shawl tighter though the heat had not dropped, her eyes fixed in the same direction, and one by one, without speaking, others began to notice it too, that subtle shift, that distant presence that could not yet be seen, but could no longer be ignored. Inside the cell, Naya closed her hand around the necklace once more, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and she whispered something too, soft for anyone to hear, not a plea, not a warning, but something closer to certainty. The wind moved again, carrying with it a sound that this time did not disappear, a rhythm beneath the silence, steady, measured, growing, and far beyond the edge of Red Hollow, where the land opened wide under the late afternoon sun, a line had begun to form, not hurried, not hidden, but certain in its direction, as if drawn by something older than the town itself, something that did not need to announce its arrival to be understood. By the time the sound became unmistakable, it was no longer just the boy who heard it. It was the whole town, though no one said it out loud, because naming it would make it real, and reality was something Red Hollow preferred to delay. The rhythm carried low across the open land, steady and unbroken, like a heartbeat too large for one man to own, and Caleb Dorsey stood at the edge of the street, his eyes fixed on the far horizon where heat shimmer blurred the line between earth and sky, his hand resting near his belt not from instinct, but from habit, a gesture learned over years that suddenly felt smaller than it once had. Behind him, the town had slowed, not stopped, just slowed enough that every movement felt measured, deliberate, as if each person was waiting for someone else to decide what came next. The saloon doors remained half open, unmoving now, the piano inside silent, a glass left untouched on the bar catching a sliver of light that did not shift. The boy by the trough took one step forward, then another, drawn not by curiosity, but by something closer to recognition, his small boots leaving shallow prints in the dust as he stared toward the road that led in from the west. Inside the cell, Naya lifted her head slightly, not because she heard the sound, but because she felt the change, the same way the air feels different before rain, even when the sky remains clear, and her fingers relaxed around the silver necklace, letting it hang for a moment between her hands, catching that narrow beam of light again, a quiet signal in a room that held no voice. Outside, a woman set down the basket she had been carrying, though she could not say why, and a man removed his hat without realizing he had done it, his gaze fixed in the same direction as the others, and slowly, without command or call, The town began to gather along the street, not forming a line, not forming anything at all, just drawn by the same pull that had reached them all at once. Caleb took a single step forward into the street, then stopped, the weight in his chest no longer something he could dismiss. And for the first time since the morning, he turned his head slightly, glancing back toward the jail, toward the quiet figure inside, and the memory of her words returned not as sound, but as pressure. "You are arresting what you do not understand." And he exhaled once, slow, controlled, as if trying to steady something that had already begun to move. The sound grew clearer now, no longer hidden by distance, the unmistakable cadence of horses moving together, not rushed, not scattered, but aligned. And as the first shapes appeared through the heat haze, dark against the pale horizon, the town did not gasp, did not shout. It simply stood, still and silent, watching as the line took form, rider after rider emerging into view, stretching farther than the eye could count at a glance. There were no raised weapons, no hurried movements, only presence, steady and undeniable, and at the front of that line rode a man whose posture alone carried weight, his gaze fixed ahead, not searching, not questioning, simply arriving. Inside the cell, Naya closed her hand around the necklace one last time, then let it rest against her palm, her shoulders easing just slightly, not in relief, but in certainty, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally stepped into the light. Outside, Caleb Dorsey did not move, though every instinct told him to, because something deeper than instinct held him in place, something that understood this was no longer his moment to control. And as the riders drew closer, the dust beneath their horses rising in soft clouds that caught the late afternoon sun, the town of Red Hollow stood in a silence that felt older than fear, a silence that comes when truth does not need to announce itself, only to arrive. The riders did not slow as they reached the edge of town, and that was the first thing that unsettled everyone watching. Not their number, not their silence, but the certainty in the way they moved, as if Red Hollow had never been a destination, only a point along a path already chosen. The dust rose beneath their horses in soft waves, catching the late light, turning the air gold and heavy, and still no voice broke the quiet. Not from the townspeople, not from the riders, only the steady rhythm of hooves settling into stillness as one by one they came to a stop along the main road. Sheriff Caleb Dorsey stood where he was, though the space around him had changed, the distance between him and the crowd no longer just measured in feet, but in something less visible, something that had begun to pull away from him the moment the first rider appeared. The man at the front dismounted without haste, his boots touching the ground with a softness that carried more weight than any command. And he did not look at the sheriff first, did not scan the buildings or the faces. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the silence hold, as if giving the town time to understand what had already arrived. Behind him, the line of riders remained still, not shifting, not reaching, their presence steady like the land itself, and among them, 5 older figures stepped forward slowly, their movements deliberate, each step measured in a way that spoke of something older than authority, something closer to memory. Caleb finally moved, just a single step forward, his boots pressing into the dust, and his voice, when it came, was firm, but it carried a tension that had not been there before. "This is a town under law," he said, the words sounding smaller than he intended, as if the air itself resisted holding them, and no one answered him, not immediately, not because they did. Not here, but because the moment did not belong to his voice anymore. The man at the front turned his head slightly then, his gaze passing over Caleb without stopping, moving instead toward the small wooden jail, and for the first time, something shifted in the sheriff's posture, not visible enough to name, but enough to feel. Inside, Naya stood now, no longer seated, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the silver necklace visible in her palm, catching the narrow beam of light as it moved across the floor. And when the shadow of the riders reached the jail window, the light dimmed just enough to change the room, just enough to mark the moment. Outside, the older man took a step forward, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, low, carrying across the street without effort. "We did not come for your law," he said, and the words settled into the town like something remembered rather than spoken. We came for what you have taken. And still, there was no threat in his tone, no rise in volume, only a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The boy near the trough took another step forward, his eyes wide now, not with fear, but with something closer to awe, as if he was seeing a story unfold that he would carry long after this day ended. Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand lowering from where it had rested, and for a brief moment, he glanced again toward the jail, toward the quiet figure inside, and something in his expression flickered, something uncertain, something that did not fit the man he had believed himself to be that morning. The older man's gaze did not leave the building, and the riders behind him remained still, their presence filling the street without pressing against it, and the town of Red Hollow stood caught between what it had been and what it was about to understand, the air thick with a silence that no longer waited, but listened. The words settled, and for a long moment, no one moved. Not the riders, not the townspeople, not even the wind that had carried them in, as if the entire street had been held in place by something invisible and absolute. Sheriff Caleb Dorsey felt it first in his chest, that quiet pressure that does not come from fear, but from recognition, the kind a man does not admit even to himself, and he straightened slightly, as if posture alone could return control to his hands. "No one has taken anything," he said, his voice steady but thinner now, stretched across a silence that did not hold it the way it once would have, and the older man did not answer him right away, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply turned his gaze from the jail door to Caleb, and in that look there was no anger, only a kind of clarity that made the sheriff feel, for the first time, like he was being seen rather than obeyed. Inside the cell, Naya stepped closer to the bars, the soft scrape of her boots against the wooden floor barely audible, and the light shifted again, catching the silver necklace in her hand, letting it glint once before resting again, and her eyes lifted, not toward the riders, but toward the space between them, as if she was watching something unfold that no one else could yet see. Outside, one of the townsmen shifted his weight, then spoke quietly, almost to himself. It was not her. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and the sound carried farther than he expected, reaching ears that had not planned to listen. And suddenly the silence changed, not broken, but altered, like a surface that had cracked just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Caleb turned his head sharply toward the voice, his jaw tightening, but the man did not meet his gaze, instead staring down at the dust, as if the ground itself held more certainty than anything above it. The boy near the trough stepped forward again, his small voice following, hesitant but clear. "I saw it," he said, and this time, the street did not stay still. Heads turned, eyes shifted, and something began to move through the crowd. Not noise, not yet, but the beginning of something that could not be pulled back once it had been spoken. Caleb's hand dropped fully to his side now, no longer hovering, no longer pretending, and he took a breath that did not steady him the way it used to, because the moment had changed, and he could feel it slipping beyond the reach of authority. The older man watched all of this without interruption, his expression unchanged, as if this was the part he had been waiting for, not the arrival, not the numbers, but the moment when truth began to surface on its own, without force, without command. Inside the cell, Naya's fingers loosened, and the necklace fell gently against her palm, and for the first time, she stepped fully into the light, her face calm, her posture unbroken, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the bars and into the street, not loud, not urgent, but steady in a way that made people listen. "It was never about the horse," she said, and the words landed softly, but they did not disappear. They stayed, settling into every space between the people standing there. Caleb looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression shifted again, something closer to understanding than denial, and yet he said nothing, because there was nothing left that would hold. The older man took one step closer to the jail, his boots quiet against the dust, and he did not reach for the door, did not touch the lock. He only stood there, looking at the girl inside, and the space between them carried more weight than any action could have, and behind him, the riders remained still, their presence no longer a question, but an answer that had already begun to unfold, not through force, but through the simple act of being witnessed. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over Red Hollow like a shadow that did not belong to the sun, and in that stillness, the truth began to take shape in ways no one could ignore anymore. Sheriff Caleb Dorsey stood motionless, but inside him something had already shifted, the weight of his own decision pressing against him now not as certainty, but as something unfinished, something that no longer held its ground the way it had just hours before. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less authority and more question than he intended. "Then speak it," he said, looking directly at Naya, not as an officer, but as a man who needed the answer to come from somewhere other than himself. Naya held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him, not to the riders, but to the people of the town, to the faces that had watched without speaking, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, quiet, but it carried farther now, carried because it was no longer alone. "The horse was never taken," she said. "It was hidden," and the word lingered in the air, simple, undeniable, and the boy stepped forward again, his small frame now at the edge of the street, his voice stronger this time. "Behind the grain barn," he said, pointing without hesitation. "I saw it before sunrise." And the crowd shifted, not in panic, not in fear, but in recognition, as if something they had all sensed but refused to name had finally been given form. Caleb's eyes followed the direction of the boy's hand, and for a moment, he said nothing, because in that instant, the truth did not feel like an answer. It felt like a mirror, and what it showed him was not a mistake made in haste, but a choice made in convenience. The older man near the jail did not move, did not react, but his presence seemed to grow heavier, not pressing, not demanding, simply existing in a way that left no room for anything false to stand. Beside it, one of the townsmen took a slow step back, removing his hat again, this time not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, though he could not say for what exactly. And the woman who had set down her basket earlier now picked it up again, but she did not leave. She stayed, watching, as if she understood that leaving would mean turning away from something she needed to see through. Caleb took a breath, long and slow, and the air did not fill his lungs the way it used to, because it carried something else now, something heavier than dust and heat, something that settled in his chest and refused to move. And he turned, not toward the crowd, not toward the riders, but toward the jail door, his steps measured, each one deliberate, each one louder than the last in the quiet that surrounded him. Inside, Naya did not step back, did not move away. She simply waited, her hand still holding the silver necklace. And as Caleb reached the door, his hand paused just before the handle, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood, for the first time, what it meant to do it. The riders remained still behind him, not watching him, not judging him, simply present, as if the moment belonged entirely to him now, as if the choice had always been his to make. And the older man stood where he was, his gaze steady, not expecting, not demanding, only witnessing. Caleb's fingers closed around the handle, and the wood felt warmer than it should have, like something that had been waiting. And when he opened the door, the sound was not loud, not final, just a simple movement, a small shift, but it carried through the street like something far greater, because in that moment, the law he had stood on began to change, not by force, not by fear, but by the quiet weight of truth finally being allowed to stand. The door opened, and with it something unseen shifted across the town, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet change that settled into every pair of eyes watching. And Sheriff Caleb Dorsey stepped inside, without hesitation this time, the dim light swallowing him for a moment before he reached forward and unlocked the iron from Naya's wrists, the metal falling away with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo farther than it should have. He did not speak as he did it, and neither did she, because the moment did not need words. It needed only the act, simple and undeniable. And when she stepped forward out of the cell, the light caught her again, tracing the outline of her figure as she crossed the threshold, not as someone freed, but as someone who had never truly been held. Outside, the town watched in silence as she walked past Caleb, her pace steady, her gaze level, and for the first time since morning, no one looked away. Not the men by the saloon, not the woman by the basket, not even the boy who now stood in the open street, his eyes following her as if committing the moment to memory. The older man near the front of the riders did not move to meet her immediately. He waited, allowing her to reach him on her own, and when she stopped a few feet away, the space between them carried something deeper than reunion, something measured in respect rather than distance. "Were you harmed?" he asked, his voice calm, carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear it. And Naya shook her head once, slow and certain. "No," she said. Then after a brief pause, her eyes flicked briefly toward the town behind her. "Only misunderstood." And the words landed with a weight that did not accuse, did not demand, but revealed. And in that revelation, something in the air released, not tension, but illusion. Caleb stepped out of the jail then, stopping just short of the street, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting at his sides not in readiness, but in something closer to acceptance, and he looked at Naya, then at the older man, and finally at the town. And in that sequence, something shifted fully inside him, something that did not return to what it had been. The riders remained still, their presence unchanged, not advancing, not retreating, and yet the space they held now felt different, no longer looming, no longer approaching, but simply existing as it always had, waiting for others to see it clearly. The boy glanced toward the grain barn in the distance, then back at the sheriff, and, though he said nothing more, the direction of his gaze said enough, and a few of the townspeople began to follow it, their attention turning not outward, but inward, toward the place where the truth had been hidden all along. Naya opened her hand then, revealing the silver necklace fully, the metal catching the late light in a brief, steady glow, and she extended it slightly, not toward the chief, but toward the town, as if offering not an object, but a question, and for a moment, no one moved to take it, not because they did not recognize it, but because they did. Caleb saw it then, clearly, the detail he had ignored before, and his breath caught just enough to matter, because the necklace was not hers, it belonged to someone else, someone within the very town he had sworn to protect, and the realization settled into him not as shock, but as clarity, the kind that leaves no room for retreat. The older man watched him, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a patience that felt older than the moment itself, and the riders behind him remained as they were, silent, steady, present, as if the outcome had never been theirs to decide. And in the center of it all, beneath a sky that had not changed but now felt different, Red Hollow stood still, not because it was frozen, but because it was finally seeing, and in that seeing, the story that had begun with a chain and a claim of guilt had turned into something else entirely, something quieter, something heavier, something that would not leave when the dust settled. No one reached for the necklace at first, not because they did not recognize it, but because recognition carries weight, and weight asks something in return, and in Red Hollow that afternoon, what it asked was more than anyone had prepared to give. Sheriff Caleb Dorsey stepped forward slowly, not as an officer now, not as a man giving orders, but as someone following something he could no longer ignore, and his eyes stayed fixed on the silver resting in Naya's open palm, the way it caught the last stretch of sunlight, the way it seemed to hold the entire moment in its quiet reflection. He knew it then, not as suspicion, not as guesswork, but as certainty, and that certainty did not come from the object itself. It came from the faces behind him, from the subtle shifts in posture, from the silence that grew heavier around one particular place near the edge of the street. A man stood there, well-dressed compared to the others, his coat clean despite the dust, his boots untouched by the day's labor, and his eyes did not meet the scene unfolding in front of him. They stayed lowered, fixed on the ground as if it might open and give him somewhere else to stand. Caleb did not need to call his name. The town already knew, because towns always know long before they speak, and the truth had simply been waiting for the right moment to step forward. Naya did not turn toward him. She did not point, did not accuse. She only held the necklace steady, offering it not as evidence, but as something that needed to find its rightful place. And in that gesture there was no anger, no demand, only a quiet insistence that truth, once revealed, must be carried by those who recognize it. The older man watched all of this without interruption, his presence unchanged, and the riders behind him remained still, their silence now no longer heavy, but steady, like a foundation rather than a threat. Caleb took another step, then another, until he stood between Naya and the man at the edge of the street. And for a moment, he said nothing, because words, once spoken, would seal what could no longer be undone. The man finally looked up then, his expression uncertain, not defiant, not even afraid, just caught, as if the moment had arrived before he had decided who he would be inside it. And Caleb held his gaze, not with anger, but with something firmer, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. "Take it," Caleb said quietly, his words directed not at the crowd, not at the riders, but at the man himself, and the simplicity of it left no room for anything else. The man hesitated, just long enough for everyone to see it, then stepped forward, each movement slower than the last, until he stood in front of Naya, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, hers steady, his searching, and in that space something passed between them that no one else could fully name. Something that had nothing to do with accusation and everything to do with choice. He reached out, his hand unsteady, and took the necklace, the metal resting in his palm now, heavier than it had been before, because now it carried meaning he could not set aside. Naya lowered her hand, her role in the moment complete, and she stepped back, not retreating, but returning, her place once again beside the older man who had not moved, who had only watched as the truth found its way without force. Caleb remained where he was, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer guarded. And as he looked out across the town, he understood something that could not be undone, that law without truth is only shadow, and shadow disappears the moment light is allowed to stand. The riders did not move, the town did not speak, and yet everything had changed, not through conflict, not through command, but through the quiet, undeniable act of seeing what had always been there. The man stood there with the necklace in his hand, and for a long moment he did not move, as if the weight of it had anchored him to the ground beneath his boots, and the town watched not with anger, not with noise, but with a quiet attention that felt heavier than any judgment spoken out loud. "Sheriff." Caleb Dorsey did not step closer, did not reach for the man, because this was no longer something that could be enforced. It was something that had to be chosen, and the choice hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. The man's fingers tightened slightly around the silver, then loosened, his breath unsteady but controlled, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, not meant for the crowd, but heard by all the same. "I found it," he said, the words simple, but they did not carry the truth fully yet, and he paused, his gaze shifting once toward Naya, who stood still, her expression unchanged, not pressing, not forgiving, only present. The older man beside her did not speak, did not nod, he simply watched, as if understanding that the truth, once started, must find its own way forward. The man swallowed once, then lifted his head, his voice steadier now. "I found it, and I kept it." And this time, the words settled completely, no longer partial, no longer hidden, and in that moment, something passed through the town, not shock, not outrage, but a quiet recognition of what had been avoided, and what could no longer be. Caleb closed his eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to mark the moment, and when he opened them again, he looked at the man not as a stranger, not as a problem to be solved, but as someone who had finally stepped into the same truth he himself had only just begun to face. No one moved to restrain him, no one called out, because the act of speaking had already changed the space around them. And what remained was not punishment, but consequence, the kind that settles inside a person and stays long after the moment has passed. Naya turned her gaze away then, not dismissing him, but releasing him, her role complete, and she stepped back once more toward the older man, her place beside him not as someone protected, but as someone who had stood and allowed the truth to come forward without force. The older man inclined his head, slightly, not as approval, not as victory, but as acknowledgement, and behind him, the riders remained still, their presence now lighter, no longer pressing against the edges of the town, but resting within it like something understood. Caleb took one final step forward, then stopped, his voice quiet, steady. "The law stands," he said, not to assert it, but to redefine it. But it stands on truth. And the words did not echo, they settled, finding their place among the people who heard them. And for the first time that day, they felt like something real. The man with the necklace lowered his head, not in shame alone, but in acceptance, and he held the silver in both hands now, as if understanding that what he carried was not just an object, but a moment he would not be able to set down. The wind moved again, softer this time, lifting the edge of coats, stirring the dust in gentle patterns that no longer felt heavy, and one by one, the tension that had filled Red Hollow began to ease, not vanish, but transform into something quieter, something that would remain long after the riders had gone. The older man turned then, not abruptly, not as a signal, but simply because the moment had ended, and the riders followed, their horses, shifting, their line breaking not in disorder, but in quiet completion, and as they began to move away, the sound of hooves returned, steady, measured, carrying them back toward the open land without a single word exchanged. Naya paused once before leaving, her gaze sweeping across the town, not searching, not judging, just seeing, and then she turned as well, stepping into the line of riders, her figure blending into their presence as naturally as it had once stood apart. Caleb remained where he was, alone now in the center of a street that looked the same but felt entirely different, and he did not move, not because he could not, but because he understood that some moments are not meant to be followed, only remembered. The town slowly returned to itself, voices low, movements careful, but beneath it all, something had changed, something that would not be undone by time or distance. And as the last of the riders disappeared into the horizon, leaving only dust and silence behind, Red Hollow stood quieter than before, not from fear, but from the weight of having finally seen what had always been there.